William Faulkner, the giant of Southern Gothic literature, Nobel Prize winner, one of the most important American novelists of the 20th century. His story starts in Mississippi, where he was born in New Albany in 1897 and grew up mainly in Oxford. And that setting really mattered enormously. The landscape, the memory, all the family history. Then you add in things like race relations and then the social tensions of Mississippi that all became the material that he kept returning to for the rest of his career. Even when he invented places, they still carried the weight of the world that he grew up in. Now, William Faulkner didn't follow the neat academic plan that we've talked about with some of the other authors like Sylvia Plath, but he did briefly attend the University of Mississippi, but he was never the kind of writer whose career was really built around, formal credentials. Now, during World War I, he tried to join the military, he tried to serve, and he ultimately trained with the Royal Air Force in Canada, though the war ended before he actually saw any combat. And that early phase of his life is useful to remember because it helps explain something about him, and that he always seemed to be building himself as much as he was just discovering himself. And as a literary figure, it really didn't fully form. It just kind of assembled itself within him over the course of his life. And this all means that his early writing career developed gradually. He published poetry and in early forms of prose, but really the breakthrough came through when he began creating the fictional world that was mostly associated with his name, and that is Yoknapatawpha County. And that invented Mississippi County became one of the great settings in American literature. And through it, Faulkner was able to write not just individual stories, but this entire just historical and moral landscape. You've got families and towns and plantations, and you add to that, things like violence and just long memory, and eventually, decline and ambition, and then ultimately guilt. All of these things kept circling through the world that he created. And it gave his fiction, his stories, a great deal of scale, and even more importantly, it gave it a great deal of depth. Now, then came the books that made his reputation just, unavoidable. It just, it is skyrocketed. First, The Sound and the Fury in 1929. Then you have As I Lay Dying in 1930. And then Light in August happened, I think, in 1932. And those works showed just how far Faulkner was willing to push the novel, not these particular novels, but the shape of the novel itself. And so he began using techniques like shifting perspectives, fractured timelines, stream of consciousness, and then just really dense layering of emotions. And for some folks, when it comes to reading his work, it does make Faulkner quite difficult. And some really appreciate the challenge. Or you may have started it younger in life and you just may have to go back to it later. But there is a degree of difficulty that goes with reading his work. But that difficulty, I think, is part of the point, because he's trying to capture certain things like the way memory or family or even history actually feel, because all those things can be tangled up, they can be uneven, they can feel unfinished, and really they can just be impossible to kind of separate cleanly into their own little places. So then one of the things that makes Faulkner so important then is that he was not just writing about the South in just some kind of regional sense. He was actually, he was using the South to write about, history itself, things like how people inherit guilt or how violence can kind of hang around, how it can linger, how things like race can shape both public and private life. And then, add to that how the past just refuses to stay in the past. And really, I think that's a huge part of why his particular fiction still has an important, way of mattering to us still. Because even though his novels are deeply rooted in Mississippi, they are asking, much larger questions about some things like I've already talked about, memory and identity and power. and also all about moral responsibility. Now, Faulkner's life was not spent entirely in Mississippi. He also worked at times as a screenwriter in Hollywood, and that's kind of one of those little details that folks kind of forget. But even with those outside experiences, Rowan Oak, his home in Oxford, remained central, a core part of him. He bought the house in 1930, and he lived there until his death. And it was there that he did much of the work that secured his literary legacy. And Rowan Oak matters because it turns Faulkner from a distant, major author into somebody that was really grounded into a real place. I mean, he had real routines. He was writing in a real room. It was, his own home. And by the time Faulkner won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1949, his place in literature was, it was secure. It was firm, though the prize was actually presented to him in 1950. The Nobel Committee honored him for, as they put it, for his powerful and artistically unique contribution to the modern American novel. And that particular citation gets at, what made Faulkner so distinctive. He did not simply write memorable books. He altered what the American novel could do. And he did that both structurally and morally. William Faulkner died in 1962, but his influence has only grown. He remains one of those writers who can still really kind of like intimidate you as a reader, but when you work your way through it, it is also a reward. You as a reader are rewarded in ways few novelists really can. His books do ask a lot. They demand patience and attention and just this willingness to kind of like sit inside of a just confusion together. But in return, right, they give you something that is large, enormous. It's this vision of human lives that are shaped by time and memory and history in all of their messiness. And that's really why William Faulkner has this lasting power. When it all comes down to it, he really didn't make the American novel simpler. He made it larger in its scope and its impact. So I hope you enjoyed this. I have a video on The Sound and the Fury if you want to go back and take a watch of that one too. It's somewhere in my bio. So anyway, thanks for hanging around.